At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, American soldiers manning positions along an 85-mile stretch of the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg heard a sound they would never forget. Thunder. Except it wasn't thunder. It was 2,000 German artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously. For 90 minutes, shells rained down on American positions. Then the barrage stopped, and through the morning fog came German tanks. Hundreds of them, followed by over 200,000 German infantry soldiers screaming and charging forward. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. Intelligence had said the Germans were finished. The war was almost over. Everyone expected to be home by Christmas. Instead, Hitler had scraped together his last reserves and launched the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. Over the next 6 weeks, in the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, Americans and Germans would fight the largest and bloodiest battle the U.S. Army experienced in World War II. Over 600,000 American soldiers fought in the Battle of the Bulge. 19,000 died. 60,000 were wounded or captured. It was America's costliest battle of the entire war. And it began with Hitler's desperate last gamble to change the course of a war he was already losing. This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final offensive. The battle that created a massive bulge in the Allied lines that gave the battle its name. The last time German forces would threaten Western Europe. And the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. By December 1944, Germany was collapsing. The Allies had landed in Normandy on D-Day in June. They'd liberated Paris in August. By September, Allied armies were pushing into Germany itself from the west. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly, having driven German forces back across hundreds of miles. Germany had lost the war. Everyone knew it. Everyone except Adolf Hitler. Hitler refused to accept defeat. He believed one dramatic victory could change everything. If he could split the Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and destroy several American and British divisions, the Western Allies might be forced to negotiate peace. Then Germany could focus all its forces on stopping the Soviets in the East. It was delusional thinking. But Hitler was beyond reason. He chose the Ardennes forest for his attack. The same forest the Germans had come through in 1940 when they invaded France. Back then, the French had dismissed the Ardennes as impassable for large armored forces. They'd been wrong. Now, in December 1944, the Americans were making the same mistake. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector. Veteran units went there to rest after heavy fighting. New units were sent there to gain experience before being committed to serious combat. It was the last place anyone expected a major German offensive. Hitler assembled forces in complete secrecy. 25 divisions. Over 200,000 men. 400 tanks and assault guns. 2,000 artillery pieces. The forces were organized into 3 armies. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the north under Sepp Dietrich. The 5th Panzer Army in the center under Otto von Manschufel. And the 7th Army in the south under Erich Brandenburger. The plan called for rapid penetration through American lines, a race to the Meuse River, then on to Antwerp, splitting British forces in the north from American forces in the south. Security was absolute. No radio communications about the offensive. All orders delivered by courier. Troop movements conducted at night. Dummy radio traffic maintained at old positions to fool Allied intelligence. The Americans had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence said Germany lacked the resources for major offensive operations. They were focused on their own plans to push into Germany. Nobody was expecting an attack. The weather helped the Germans. Heavy overcast meant Allied air superiority was neutralized. Planes couldn't fly. Reconnaissance couldn't spot German troop buildups. The Germans moved their assault forces into position in complete secrecy. By December 15th, everything was ready. The attack would begin at dawn the next day. The Americans in the Ardennes were spread thin across a wide front. The 106th Infantry Division, freshly arrived from the States, held positions in the Schnee Eifel. The 28th Infantry Division, badly mauled in the Hurtgen Forest, was resting and rebuilding. The 99th Infantry Division was relatively inexperienced. And scattered among these divisions were various smaller units, cavalry reconnaissance squadrons, engineer battalions, artillery units. None of them expected what was about to hit them. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the German artillery barrage began. 90 minutes of sustained shelling. Communications were knocked out. Command posts were destroyed. Soldiers huddled in foxholes as shells exploded around them. When the barrage finally lifted, German infantry and tanks appeared through the fog and falling snow. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The German assault achieved complete surprise. American units were overrun. The 106th Division's 422nd and 423rd Regiments, about 8,000 men, were surrounded in the Schnee Eifel. They held out for 3 days before being forced to surrender on December 19th. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. Entire companies and battalions simply ceased to exist, destroyed or captured in the first hours of the offensive. But not all American units collapsed. Some fought back fiercely despite being outnumbered and surrounded. At the town of St. Vith, American forces cobbled together a defense from the remnants of shattered units. Engineers, cooks, clerks, anyone who could hold a rifle was put on the line. For 6 days, they held St. Vith against overwhelming German forces, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. When they finally withdrew on December 21st, they delayed the German advance by nearly a week. At Bastogne, an even more dramatic defense took shape. Bastogne was a small Belgian town sitting at a crucial road junction. 7 roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed it. But the Americans got there first. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed forward from reserve positions in France, arrived just hours before German forces surrounded the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe took command of the defense. About 18,000 American troops, mostly from the 101st but including elements of other units, were now trapped in Bastogne. The Germans demanded surrender. On December 22nd, German officers delivered an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. McAuliffe's response became legendary: nuts. When the German officers asked for clarification, an American colonel explained, "It means go to hell." The siege of Bastogne continued. The conditions were brutal. December 1944 was one of the coldest winters on record. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow fell constantly. Soldiers had no winter clothing. They wore regular uniforms, often soaked through from the snow. Frostbite became as dangerous as German bullets. Men lost fingers, toes, entire feet to the cold. Medical supplies ran low. The wounded suffered terribly. And there was a darker aspect to the battle: war crimes. On December 17th, near the village of Malmedy, units of the 1st SS Panzer Division under Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper captured about 120 American soldiers. The Americans were disarmed and assembled in a field. Then the Germans opened fire with machine guns. 84 Americans were murdered. Those who survived the initial shooting and tried to escape were hunted down and killed. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, enraged American troops. Word spread quickly. Take no SS prisoners became an unofficial order in some units. Paper's battle group continued its advance, committing more atrocities along the way. Belgian civilians were murdered. More American prisoners were executed. But Paper's advance eventually stalled. He ran out of fuel. American resistance stiffened. On December 24th, with his forces surrounded and out of ammunition, Paper abandoned his vehicles and led his men on foot back to German lines. He'd come within miles of the Meuse River before being stopped. The weather that had helped the Germans initially now turned against them. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. Allied aircraft took to the air by the thousands. P-47 Thunderbolts. P-51 Mustangs. British Typhoons. They strafed German columns, bombed supply lines, attacked tanks. German forces, which had been making steady progress, suddenly found themselves under constant air attack. Supply convoys were destroyed. Fuel trucks were burning. The German advance began to slow. General George S. Patton performed one of the great feats of military logistics in history. On December 19th, at a conference with Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, Patton was asked when he could attack north to relieve Bastogne. Patton said December 22. The other generals were skeptical. Patton's Third Army was currently fighting southeast of the Bulge. To attack north meant disengaging from current operations, turning 90 degrees, moving over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles over icy roads in winter conditions, and attacking within 72 hours. It seemed impossible. Patton did it. His staff had already been planning for this contingency. Within hours, entire divisions were moving. On December 22, exactly when Patton said they would, the Third Army attacked north toward Bastogne. For 4 days they fought through heavy German resistance. Villages were taken in brutal house-to-house fighting. Roads were choked with destroyed vehicles. But Patton's forces kept advancing. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The 101st Airborne and other defenders had held for a week against overwhelming odds. Their stand at Bastogne became one of the most famous defensive actions in American military history. The town's name became synonymous with courage and determination. But the battle wasn't over. The Germans still held a massive salient, the Bulge, pushed deep into Allied lines. Throughout late December and into January, Allied forces attacked from north and south, trying to pinch off the Bulge and trap the German forces inside. The fighting was savage. Villages changed hands multiple times. The weather remained brutally cold. Casualties mounted on both sides. The German offensive had failed. They'd pushed 50 miles into Allied lines but hadn't reached the Meuse River. They'd failed to capture major supply depots. They hadn't split the Allied armies. And now, with Allied reinforcements arriving and air power dominant, the Germans were being pushed back. By January 16, 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. The front lines were roughly back where they'd been on December 16. But the cost was staggering. American casualties totaled about 89,000. 19,000 killed. 47,000 wounded. 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest battle for American forces in World War II. The 106th Infantry Division essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. Dozens of other units were mauled. Entire companies were wiped out. German casualties were even worse. About 100,000 total. 12,000 killed. 38,000 wounded. 30,000 captured. But worse than the casualty numbers was what Germany lost in resources. 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned. 1,000 aircraft lost. Precious fuel burned. Ammunition expended. These were losses Germany couldn't replace. The Ardennes offensive consumed the last strategic reserves Germany possessed. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets took advantage of Germany's focus on the West. On January 12, 1945, just as the Battle of the Bulge was ending, the Soviets launched a massive winter offensive. German forces in the east, weakened by the transfer of divisions to the Ardennes, collapsed. Within weeks, Soviet forces were racing across Poland toward Germany itself. Hitler's gamble in the West had fatally weakened his ability to defend in the East. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last time Germany could launch a major offensive. After the Bulge, it was all retreat. The Allies crossed the Rhine in March. Soviet forces reached Berlin in April. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The battle produced countless individual stories of heroism and survival. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne became legendary, but their stand was only possible because units like the Defenders of St. Vith had delayed the German advance. Small groups of engineers blowing bridges. Artillery crews fighting as infantry when their positions were overrun. Tank destroyers ambushing German armor. Medics treating wounded under fire. Every unit in the Ardennes has its stories. There were also stories of confusion and chaos. The Germans infiltrated English-speaking commandos wearing American uniforms behind Allied lines. Operation Greif, led by Otto Skorzeny, aimed to create confusion by changing road signs, cutting communications, and spreading false orders. The operation had limited military impact but created paranoia. American soldiers started challenging each other with questions about American culture that a German couldn't answer. Who won the World Series? Who's married to Betty Grable? Some American officers were detained because they gave wrong answers. The battle also demonstrated racial injustice even in wartime. The U.S. Army was still segregated in 1944. Black soldiers served in separate units, usually in support roles rather than combat. But the manpower crisis during the Bulge forced changes. For the first time, black volunteers were allowed to serve in integrated combat units fighting alongside white soldiers. Over 2,500 black soldiers volunteered. They fought with distinction. After the war, their service helped pave the way for military desegregation. The Malmedy massacre remained a source of anger and controversy. After the war, Joachim Paper and other members of his battle group were tried for war crimes. 73 were convicted. 43 were sentenced to death, though most sentences were later commuted. Paper served 11 years in prison. He was released in 1956 and lived in France until 1976 when he was murdered, likely by revenge seekers who'd finally found him. The Battle of the Bulge entered American popular culture. Films like Battleground in 1949 and Battle of the Bulge in 1965 dramatized the fighting, though with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Books, memoirs, and documentaries have told and retold the story. Veterans gathered annually to remember their fallen comrades and share their experiences. As they aged and passed away, their children and grandchildren took up the task of remembering. Today, the Ardennes region where the battle was fought is peaceful. Forests have regrown. Villages have been rebuilt. But reminders of the battle remain. Museums in Bastogne and other towns display artifacts and tell the story. The Martison Memorial, a star-shaped monument, honors the American soldiers who fought there. Every December, ceremonies commemorate the battle and honor those who fought. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, and it failed. He'd bet everything on one dramatic victory that would change the course of the war. Instead, he destroyed Germany's last reserves, weakened the Eastern Front, and accelerated Germany's defeat. The offensive that was supposed to save Germany helped doom it. For the Americans who fought there, the Battle of the Bulge was a crucible. They'd been surprised, outnumbered, and outgunned. They'd fought in terrible conditions against a determined enemy. Many died. Many more were wounded or captured. But they'd held. They'd delayed the German advance. They'd bought time for reinforcements. And they'd proven that American soldiers, even when caught off guard and pushed to the breaking point, wouldn't break. The battle that created the Bulge in Allied lines was Hitler's last attempt to change his fate. It failed. And in failing, it ensured that the war would end with Germany's total defeat just 5 months later. The Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. And he lost.